Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the guilty verdict on all charges for Officer Chauvin and the hope that this is one small step toward holding people accountable for racial injustices. With that, I'd like to welcome all of you to the second session of our program discussing ADUs, accessory dwelling units. I'm Sonia Feldman with Action Annapolis. We're a nonpartisan grassroots group here in Greater Annapolis. Our goal is to provide information to our community on topics that we feel are critical to an informed electorate. We'd like to thank our partner for the evening, the Chesapeake Bay chapter of the American Institute of Architects. You can visit the Action Annapolis YouTube channel and watch other programs in our affordable housing series. We've discussed the history of racial discrimination in housing, both nationally and here in Annapolis. You'll also find our program on eviction prevention all on our YouTube channel at Action Annapolis right here. This evening, we're continuing the conversation on affordable housing by taking a look at the role that ADUs can play as one strategy for filling what has been referred to as missing middle housing. Missing middle housing helps fill a gap in the housing market. By increasing the number of diverse housing options, communities can work toward building neighborhoods that are more inclusive and economically competitive. They can serve to better reflect the racial demographics of an area or to accommodate aging parents who want to maintain a level of independence, or young adults who can't find an affordable place to live, or a person with disabilities who benefits from family support, and middle-income families who have been priced out of the market. ADUs can be one strategy that can help to achieve many of these goals without changing the character of our neighborhoods. Tonight, we'll be featuring a panel of local city and county legislators who will discuss possibilities for ADUs here in Annapolis. If you have a question to ask our speakers tonight, you can submit it in the comments section right here on YouTube. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Please join us again this fall as we present video interviews and debates between our candidates running for mayor of Annapolis and for the city council. We're going to give you a chance to really get to know who's going to be running our city. Details will be posted on our website at actionannapolis.com. Okay, here comes the pitch. We're an all-volunteer organization that relies on generous community support to help us cover speaker fees and other expenses associated with hosting and promoting events like this one. We have no paid staff and do not charge membership fees, and we rely solely on contributions to support our work. A donation of any size would help us connect with more members of our community. Please see the link in the comment section to make a donation. Thank you in advance. And now, Chris and Polly with Action Annapolis will introduce our guests for the evening. Thank you.
Well, welcome this evening. We have our favorite moderator, Reverend Dr. Carletta Allen, who is going to be the moderator for our 6 excellent panelists. And we have with us this evening Greg Cantori, who's a nonprofit housing advocate and owner and principal of Cantori Cares. Then we will hear from Brooke Schandelmeyer. He's the Ward 5 alderman for the city of Annapolis. Then Lisa Rodvian, our County Council Vice Chair for District 5 in Anne Arundel County. We'll also hear from Hans Riemer, a councilman in Montgomery County, Maryland, where they have modernized their ADU regulations. And so he has some experience to share with us. We have Lois Schrammick, the Senior Advocate and Principal of Heart and Soul for Seniors, and Dewan Gay, the Ward 6 Alderman from the city of Annapolis. We will begin with Greg Cantori.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and give us a quick synopsis here of what ADUs might look like, and go ahead and pull this up. Okay. So What are exactly accessory dwelling units? What we're going to do tonight is review this probably once, maybe twice, because understanding exactly what they are is sometimes a little confusing. But generally they're 300 to about 1,200 square feet. And they can be either on foundations or on wheels. And you can see in some of the pictures here, you can see the tiny house on wheels is one of the more out there ADUs, but they can most likely are on foundations, and they can also be inside a home as well. What really defines an ADU is the fact that they have a separate entrance. That's what really makes it different than like a roommate or something else you might do in your home. And they have a separate kitchen and a separate bathroom. So basically set up like an apartment on that. And here you can kind of get see the way an ADU really can work, and also see how it looks from a neighborhood perspective. So one of the common things here is a basement conversion. And this is something that's been done for many, many years. A lot of folks have teenagers that live in the basements and have semi-converted it, right? But an actual ADU conversion includes, again, a separate entrance, a kitchen, and a bathroom, as well as a bedroom in there. And that's good use of space if a basement is large enough. Another one is converting a garage. A lot of folks use garages for storage, and that's about it. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're going to do with our own garage, actually, but we can convert that to an ADU. And another way to do that is actually to build a separate little home in the backyard. And we call that a detached ADU. And they can be of all kinds of designs. A lot of times they will complement the house. And I'll show you a couple of quick pictures of even in Annapolis where it complements very nicely. And lastly is the attached ADU. And that's where very similar to all the folks that you've seen in all the neighborhoods who go ahead and build additions to their house. It's going to look just the same. The only difference, again, being that there will be a separate entrance, a kitchen, and a bathroom built onto that. So what do we call ADUs? You know, it sounds like a technical term, but you may have heard these other terms: a carriage house, a granny flat, garage basement, in-law suite, secondary unit, guest house, and a caretaker cottage. And in these pictures here, you can see a separate detached ADU, but also a basement ADU there, down there. And it could be, the one in the back could be a caretaker cottage for someone who's elderly, who needs additional care. It could be an aging parent and so on. But this gives you an idea of what they might look like. And why are we interested in ADUs right now? This is a dramatic graph that just has been shocking to me every time I look at this. And that is that in the 1890s, before 1900, the average house size was under 1,000 square feet. And the average house in terms of number of people living in that house was close to 5. So you had 5 people living in under 1,000 square feet. Looking at the graph as we move towards the right there, look what happened. The houses got much, much bigger. We're up to about over 2,500 square feet. In fact, in some cases, it's been close to 2,800 square feet. And we're only about 2.5 people living in that large house. We've gone from 200 square feet per person to over 1,000 square feet per person, just to put that in perspective. And it means we have a lot of excess space in houses, and that excess space could be used as an ADU. Another issue here is that really, as you can see, our older population has a real challenge with housing. And we know right now we're in the middle of a housing crisis. The pandemic has made that much, much worse. Even before the pandemic, we had a housing crisis. But this graph shows you what we call basically overburdened. This means that these are folks that are paying more than 50% of their income on either a rent or a mortgage. And the orange there shows people who are paying more than 60% towards that rent or mortgage. And you can see that as folks were getting older, even if they own without a mortgage, even if they own outright, up to 20% of our older folks are stressed with their housing. And if they have a mortgage, it's much, much worse. It gets close to 50%. And if you're a renter, it's even worse than that. You can see even in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, close to 50% are burdened by the cost of housing on that. So why are ADUs here? Well, one of the things is that they're affordable just by the fact that they're small. They're adaptable in terms of using, and they're traditional. My mom actually lived in an ADU because my grandfather was a butler. And there was a small house in the backyard, and the entire family lived in that small house in the backyard. And she grew up in that ADU and had a wonderful experience actually there doing that. So they're traditional. It's a traditional form of housing from as long as housing's been around. We call them outbuildings, caretaker cottages, and so on. The AARP poll has shown that when folks were asked about the possibility of an ADU, that they said, wow, this would be a great place for someone that needs care that I could keep close by without being right on top of them. It could be for my relatives, for my friends. I would feel safer having someone there next to me. It would be a great place to share with guests when it's not being occupied by one of my family members. It'll increase the value of my home. It's a place for a caregiver to stay, especially since assisted living is becoming more and more expensive, about $10,000 a month now on average. And it's a way to earn rental income. If everyone else has moved out, this is a great way for me to be able to afford to live where I currently live. I don't have to move somewhere else. And that's what they said. Quick story. This is my little ADU. We used it as an office in our backyard, and then it became actually a guest house. And this is on wheels, and it's now in West Virginia. That's where we moved it to. Just to give you a quick picture of what it looks like on the inside. And this is a detached ADU. You can see they're very cute. This one's about 500 square feet. And here's an interior picture, light and airy. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in something like that? That's just really, really gorgeous space on that. And here's the different kinds of ADUs. This is one on the left side over top of a garage. Someone went ahead and converted an accessory house, basically, or a shed into an ADU. And this is in Annapolis. I took a bike ride around and just started taking pictures. And this is in the Bay Ridge area. This is a garage with an apartment above it. And this is also in Bay Ridge. This is a 2-car garage with an apartment above it and a nice deck. Also in the same neighborhood, you can see in the back there is a small unit. Now that one, I don't know if it's an ADU or not, but could be very easily converted to one. But look at how nicely it matches the house. It really fits nicely. You can see the separate entrance, and it's got privacy and so on back there. And this one I love because it's like the hidden ADU. Where is the ADU? Well, there it is right in front of you. Is that little red house on the left of the porch on there. Again, in Bay Ridge. And this is our experiment. We are converting a garage in the back of my daughter's house in Essex, actually, in Baltimore County. We're about ready to compare Baltimore County to Montgomery County, which has the most progressive, and Hans will tell us more about that. But look at how ugly the garage is right now. That's an eyesore. And that's not really a benefit to the neighborhood, and it's not doing anything except storing junk in it right now. So we're going to convert it to a 400 square foot ADU, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, kitchen, washer, dryer, and a nice little courtyard. And that's what it's going to look like. It's going to have a privacy fence around it, a trellis. The inside will be light and airy with a cathedral ceiling. And it's all on one floor. That's a storage loft above it, but it's all on one floor so that if someone has a wheelchair, they can go ahead and get into that. And finally, the issues that we need to look at, and we'll be talking about this evening, are the need for this to be a by right by the homeowner. So that means that it doesn't need a special hearing, that as long as it meets the codes, it can be very easily permitted. And we need to find a way to find financing, because a lot of folks either have to use cash or home equity to do it. The design build process needs to be very simple and fast, because that can take many, many months and very, very challenging. The rental aspect, everyone needs to understand that if you're going to do this, it's not necessarily the easiest thing if you rent it out. You have to be a landlord, and you have to understand what the responsibilities are. They are affordable just by being smaller. Okay, even if we don't have subsidies and so on, just by being smaller, they are. And the people with disabilities have severe housing challenges right now. So they really, really need this. And living near where you work, important, because a lot of neighborhoods are inaccessible because of the single family zoning that allows that to happen. And it's an alternative to assisted living, as I mentioned before. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is going to be Brooks Schandelmeyer, Ward 5 Alderman in the city of Annapolis. Brooks.
Hello, everybody. So I've put together another fun PowerPoint. But I should be able to see my screen. All right, you guys. So accessory dwelling units and how homeowners can kind of help solve our housing shortage. I took a picture here of an example of an accessory dwelling unit. This is an above garage apartment, probably one of the more common types. And notice how it matches the house and this character of this community very well. So accessory dwelling units, as they've been described, some examples, they can be an apartment over a garage, a tiny home in a backyard. They could be a basement apartment. One thing that our accessory dwelling unit bill being put forward in the city does is it does require an actual foundation. We are not going to be allowing tiny homes on wheels, no trailers, but that still gives us a wide variety of options to expand the housing stock in this city. It's going to allow all of these, the detached accessory dwelling unit, the attached one, above garage, interior basement. The biggest thing that it has to do with going through our codes is it has to meet a minimum of 150 square feet of livable space, a maximum of 850 square feet of livable space, a separate entrance or exit, and there can only be one per lot. And finally, something I was very proud of to make sure that people couldn't argue that this was just going to be a shanty, basic housing safety standards. These are going to be a safe, legitimate source of housing. The reason I introduced this bill was because accessory dwelling units are a very low impact way to expand our housing options. We're developing them on lots that have already been cleared. It's not going to require a whole digging up and clearing of trees in a new site. They match the character of our community, and the market rates of these houses keep them either lower or equally affordable to local apartments and housing stocks in the area. And I know this because I used to live in one. Accessory dwelling units let me come to this city. I rented an above garage apartment in an undocumented accessory dwelling unit, and I couldn't have afforded to live in this city otherwise. And I don't think it can be argued that people like me who want to come here won't contribute to our town. We offer a lot, and we're excited to come here, and we're excited to find a way to live and contribute to this community. And I also introduced this because Annapolis has an affordable housing crisis. National Association of Home Builders ranks Annapolis as having one of the least affordable housing markets in the country. We are worse than Washington. We are worse than Portland. We are worse than Boston. That is embarrassing to me. We do not have the kind of incomes that some of these cities offer, and we are watching the housing prices cut out more and more families and people. And many people who work in this city, especially in our service industry, an industry where I worked in for years, can't afford to live in Annapolis. That puts more commuters on the road, that causes more traffic, that hurts so many of the causes that we claim to want to stop when we try to fight these types of small home building projects. And I don't even have a fun quip or bubble for this. This is from our Annapolis Affordable Housing Task Force. The findings indicate that the city of Annapolis is outpacing most cities one would compare Annapolis to, whether nearby cities, cities within the state of Maryland, comparable cities near coasts, or population. Limited space for continued development, poor urban planning over the history of Annapolis, which did not account for a maximum build-out, a widening income gap between residents, and wealthy investors buying up properties are putting market pressure on housing and forces residential unit prices to outpace the incomes within the community. That's our own housing task force, summing up the main problem that we've created in this city. And we need to expand our housing stock, simply put. The cost of living here, housing costs here, they've rapidly outpaced our average income. Our median home price, as you can see, is $1.1 million. Our median rent is $3,541. That's not sustainable. So, and here's another reason that I want to bring in this as another stock of housing. Our average population over the past decade has grown about 250 to 275 people a year. We need to develop more than 112 residential units to keep pace with that, just to keep pace. Otherwise, again, those housing costs are going to continue to skyrise. And if we only allow that in single family zoning, we will run out of space in 18 years. So some of the misconceptions people have about accessory dwelling units is, will they be bad for the environment? No. These are easy to heat and cool. There's going to be a minimum of impervious surfaces since these won't be massive developments. And finally, they're already on developed lots. This is that smart growth strategy that we used to be proud of and striving for in the state of Maryland. And we can get back to that, putting housing in areas that can handle it, in areas that won't be clear cutting a lot of trees, and areas that won't cause increased flooding. And they don't increase traffic either. There's actually data from other jurisdictions to show that no impact on traffic has occurred. And they're going to get people closer to their work, and that gets cars off of the roads. Because the big thing that we talk about when we try to push adequate public facilities ordinances onto our traffic, those don't really impact that total amount of people on there. It just pushes people downriver, so they hop on that same road on Forest Drive. Instead of living in Annapolis, they're now living down on the county, and they're still getting on Forest, still causing traffic. This helps actually address our traffic problem by getting a car off the road, because someone can now be closer to a place where they work. There's no data to show that these will actually impact our parking in the city. And in fact, probably a bigger issue that's had an impact on our parking in a lot of these neighborhoods is multifamily or multi-generational housing. This bill is going to essentially just help spread that out slightly. So you might end up with more parking. And it's not going to outlaw single family zoning, which is something that someone actually accused me of. This is just going to allow an accessory structure, which is already permitted under our city code and every single area in the city, to be used as a dwelling. They're not going to take over our neighborhood. Even under the best case of scenario, we see a 1 per 25 houses. So you might be seeing one or two of these in your neighborhood or in your little area. But and they're also not going to be a magic bullet for affordable housing costs. I'm not arrogant enough to suggest that when we allow this, the housing crisis in Annapolis will be solved. But this is going to be a way to expand that stock in a very subtle, easy to manage way. And it can give grandparents or children a free place to live that's nearby so they can be taken care of or watched out for. And then it's just going to be giving another option for newcomers coming into this city. So yeah. Now here's what ADUs will be. One of many essential tools. That's the goal with this. We need to increase the tools in our toolbox to tackle this affordable housing crisis. And this is a great way to do it. They give home builders and homeowners greater flexibility to provide a resource that we all need. So everyone, I want to thank you for listening to me talk, and I'm really excited to be addressing any of your questions that you have coming up.
Thank you, Brooks. Our next speaker will be Lisa Rodvian, the County Council Vice Chair for District 6 with Anne Arundel County, and talking about spreading out from the city into the county. So Lisa, thank you.
I almost responded, thank you, Madam Chair. So this is actually a very timely conversation for Anne Arundel County. Just last night, very shortly before midnight, Anne Arundel County passed its general development plan, which basically lays out, land use and other priorities over the next decade. And I'm grateful that I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into what are ADUs, because I feel like you got a very thorough presentation on that from the first two speakers. So I thought I'd give you a little bit more information about what's going on in Anne Arundel County with respect to ADUs. Luckily, I was able to bring an amendment that ADUs should be considered as a type of housing that would be allowed in existing residential communities, which of course is where they're going to be. Just like Alderman Schandelmeyer mentioned, in the city of Annapolis, Anne Arundel County also has a pretty acute affordable housing crisis. The last time I spoke with our housing association, our housing authority for the county, the figures that I received were there are over 26,000 families on wait lists for public housing or subsidized housing, housing choice vouchers. And that includes over 60,000 people in Anne Arundel County, which, if you're familiar with the size of our county, which is just under 600,000, at least by the most recent data. We might be getting some new data soon showing that's even more, but that's about 10% of the population that is overburdened in housing and may not have appropriate housing or may not have housing at all. So also, like Alderman Schandelmeyer said, this is certainly not going to be the silver bullet. This is not the one and only solution to our affordable housing crisis. But it can be part of the solution, and it can provide just some different options in the ways that the first speakers have already described. So I'm really pleased that my colleagues actually by a 7-0 vote, and we are a 4-3. Not that everything about housing is partisan, but lots of things can be. But we were able to get full support of the council, 7-0 support for this amendment to include accessory dwelling units in our general development plan as a strategy for, creating more housing in existing communities. So I'm pretty excited about that. We will be putting forward a bill sometime. It may end up, just because of the way our legislative days work, and we have a recess in August, it can be a little risky to put in something, we're about to go in budget. So nothing during budget, because that takes up everything, takes up all our energy. But that leaves us, in the middle of June. And so, with our August recess, we may not end up putting in a bill until after the August recess. But a lot of the conversation that we're going to have here in this forum today is actually going to be very helpful from, listening to my colleague from Montgomery County who's had the experience of going through this and knows what kind of challenges and concerns people may bring to the table with an ADU law, as well as, community members that are here bringing their questions. So, this is actually, as much I'm participating in this conversation as much as a listener as I am as a panelist. I know that there are lots of different parameters that we are going to be looking at in terms of crafting our ADU law, but so many of the reasons that the other speakers have mentioned, I think are absolutely 100% fantastic reasons to make this happen. And I think there's generally support on the county council. There's absolutely support from the county executive. It sounds like there's good support in the city of Annapolis. If we can find ways to prevent sprawl, we're trying to find the delicate balance of protecting our beautiful environment that we have in Anne Arundel County, but also acknowledge that we have to build, we have to make places for people to live, and they need to be affordable given the, given the need. There's not a huge need for high-end housing. There's no shortage of, of supply in that area. It's the affordable part of the market that's really lacking. So, having opportunities for ADUs to fill in housing gap for young people, for retired people, for seniors who may want to stay in their neighborhood, rent out their main house and have an income that allows them to stay in their neighborhood where they know lots of people and have lived for a long time. Like Alderman Schandelmeyer mentioned, having a place to live as a young person on a smaller income allows you to become part of a community that you might otherwise not join, or you not be able to join into or actually move into, allowing people to move closer to their jobs. Providing housing opportunities for people with disabilities, maybe having a caretaker in either the ADU or in the main house to just have someone nearby to provide, an extra support that that a person with disabilities might need. So I just think there's so many good reasons to do this. And of course, it's like I said, it's not, and like the other panelists have said, it's not the silver bullet for affordable housing, but we need all the pieces. And if this is one piece that we can get in the mix and, grow this idea. I love the idea. I'm thrilled that the city of Annapolis is bringing forward this legislation, and hopefully we'll be following suit and watching and learning from your lessons. And I'm thrilled to hear from, what title do you got? Are you council council members, Councilman Reamer from Montgomery County, and hearing his experience about how this works. So I'm here to do my research. So I thank the other panelists, and I look forward to getting this legislation in the hands of my colleagues.
Thank you, Councilwoman Rodvian, and thank you for introducing our guest from Montgomery County, who will share with us their experience. The wonderful thing is that we don't have to start from scratch. There are other jurisdictions that have done this work and that have data that's helpful to all of us. So thank you for being here, Councilman Reamer.
Thank you. I am really excited to be here. I am inspired by the presentations I've received so far this evening. And I want to really thank the councilwoman and the alderman for using their positions of leadership to move forward on what is really, it can be a challenging issue, but it's a really, really important one. And as you said, it's not the solution to all of our challenges, but if we actually tackle the solutions that we have and put them all together, we will be able to make a big difference. And accessory dwelling units are a vital part of a housing market that is accessible to people from different walks of life and different economic positions. And multi-generational living, as we've heard, is increasingly common. It used to be the norm. It's increasingly common. And I have personal experience. When I was a kid, one of our very close family friends, their son lived in a backyard cottage, and I didn't think too much of it. Come to find out that is, almost impossible to build in Montgomery County, or was. And housing experts are very clear that this tool is one that you have to have. Well, you're lucky. Action Annapolis has been amazingly foresightful in how you've tackled this. I got started. I've had a longstanding interest in trying to do something about it, and the council actually passed legislation about 7 years ago, that attempted to change some of the rules and make accessory dwelling units a more viable option. But as time passed, it became clear that we hadn't done that all of the little compromises that we made in the end there was no path for an applicant who wanted to do one. And so as a result, we weren't getting a lot of applications. We were only getting 30 to 40 accessory dwelling unit applications every year, which in a community with 375,000 dwelling units is just not that many. So I was trying to figure out how to tackle the issue, and I just couldn't quite figure it out until I found Carl Peterson's book. And you had him present at your last panel, and he just laid it all out so clearly. As a council member, getting a chance to read a book about an issue, Backdoor Revolution, getting a chance to read a well-written, insightful book about an issue like this that you almost have to be a council member to love, or a housing activist to love. It was a remarkable experience, and it made me thrilled to be a council member and to have the opportunity to do something about the issues that I care about. So I did introduce a zoning text amendment in January of 2019 and worked it through the county council, and we passed it a little bit less than a year later. And I'm going to share my screen just to walk through a couple of the additional points. I think everyone on the panel has done such a great job, presenting the fundamentals. And there was some allusions made to research. I thought that might be something I could add to the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen now. And so this is actually the final page of my presentation, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the somewhat raucous debate that we had. On the right, there was a letter to the editor that really made a stir. Someone wrote in a letter and said, "Don't turn Montgomery County into a slum." It was very offensive rhetoric that was used about accessory dwelling units. And we had a lot of, neighborhood critics saying that, this was betraying the very contract of neighborhood zoning and things like that, which I always thought was sort of crazy, because if you look out your window, if I look out my window, I see families that are living, there with adult children in the house or with older members of generations in the house. So, how is this really different? We even made the New York Times. There was a lead editorial in the New York Times about Montgomery County's, raucous debate. But to the question of some of the major objections that were put forward about accessory dwelling units, I'm not really going to comment on whether people who rent, are worthy of living in our neighborhoods, because that's sort of a subtext to some of the objections. But let's talk about the factual objections that people raised. For example, schools. We heard from a lot of people that this would be a policy that would lead to crowding in our schools, because families would immediately move into these accessory dwelling units and crowd the local schools, which is when you really understand how the housing is used, it's clear that that's just not going to happen. Like, if you are a family living in a house, you probably aren't going to rent a basement apartment to another family. You might, but it's kind of unlikely, because you're already sort of using your property fairly maximally as a family with kids, and you'd be more likely to rent to maybe an older person, or maybe have it as something for a grandparent, rather than bringing in a second family to your property. You could, but it's pretty unlikely. So when we looked at the schools, what we actually did was we have a database of about 500 existing accessory dwelling units in the county. That's how many we have. And we basically cross-referenced that database from those applications against those addresses against school enrollment data. So we know where the address of every student in the school system, and we kind of matched how many students are coming from the properties that have an accessory dwelling unit. Because if it's true that accessory dwelling units are going to lead to, a surge of students in the schools, then they should already be doing that. We should be able to see that from our existing accessory dwelling units. Well, guess what we found out? That the average number of students coming from properties with an accessory dwelling unit was literally the same. It's 0.465 or 0.464 of a student, which means, for every 2 properties, there's almost a whole student coming off, whether that's a single, housing unit property or a property with an ADU. So it's virtually identical. There actually is a slightly lower rate. It's a 1/100th of a percentage point lower rate for the properties that have an ADU on them. So no impact whatsoever on schools. And yet that was a primary objection. We heard over and over again, you're gonna overrun our schools with, new registry. Well, let's look at the next issue we heard about cars. ADUs are gonna cause so much traffic, we've heard. Oh, they're gonna overwhelm our bucolic neighborhood with traffic. Well, once again, let's take our database of 500 ADUs that are licensed and check that against the Maryland Vehicle Administration's vehicle registration database. And what we found was that on average, properties that are single family home have about 2.1 vehicles per property. And then properties with an ADU have about 2.5 vehicles per property. So I guess for every, 3 or 4 ADUs, you might get 1 more vehicle. It's just not really a significant impact. And the same is true basically whether you're close to transit or far away from transit. And that was another assertion that they would be more likely to drive if they were farther away from transit. It's basically the same. Every 3 or so ADUs, maybe more, will add a vehicle to a neighborhood. So that's just not a significant impact. So those were some of the facts that we found, and I certainly found that lot of the critics were impervious to the facts, but the elected officials, it was very helpful. I thought the policymakers really appreciated a chance to see how this, really worked out once you got into the details. And as a result of that kind of detailed work that was done by our amazing planning department, we were able to pass this ordinance unanimously, 9-0. So I wish my colleagues, my brethren, and compatriots in Anne Arundel, success. And I'm really happy to share. I just found out 2 days ago that the number of accessory dwelling units doubled. The number of applications doubled in the first year in 2020. We went from about 50 to about 100. So that makes me optimistic that over time, we might be able to get to a couple hundred a year. And, for Montgomery County, as big a county as we are, 1 million people, we're only adding 2,000, 2,500 housing units a year. So if we could add 200 accessory dwelling units a year, that's a 10% increase in our housing supply annually. And that's a very meaningful part of a solution. So, we could even get up to higher. We could get 500 a year. I don't know what's possible. Nobody really knows. But I think the point is it's a meaningful solution with a very modest impact. And it is one that's really cherished and appreciated by families and by so many other people. So thank you for inviting me to be with you tonight. And I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much, Councilman Reamer. And after several elected officials, we get to hear a different perspective from Ms. Lois Shranick.
Good evening. My name is Lois Shranick. I am a geriatric nurse practitioner. Geriatric meaning I've seen patients that are 55 and older, which you don't think as geriatric being 55, but it is. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I was quite excited. For the past 35 years, I have worked with seniors as a healthcare provider in their homes. So I have seen how seniors live. And trust me, they do not want to leave their homes. So whenever we think of aging in place, and we have all heard that phrase, CDC, or the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they define aging in place as the ability to live in one's own home and community safely, independently, and comfortably, regardless of age, income, or ability. And I just want to emphasize, regardless of age, income, or ability level. So as we get older, what happens to us? Well, we don't move around as much as we used to. Our mobility decreases. We don't see, our vision is not as clear as it used to be. We feel isolated, which a lot of times adds to depression. And through this whole pandemic, we have seen so many older people become and feel isolated. So what do we do about this, or how can ADUs benefit? Right, just to start with, I think two of the other panel members talked about affordable living, assisting with household chores like cutting the grass, going out and doing grocery shopping, not feeling isolated. And as I was listening, when I think of the seniors, I think of someone living in their home, and it could be a large home, and if they had the ability to put an ADU or attach an ADU to their home, they could have a caregiver live with them, a family member, a college student, someone there to possibly be a companion or help just with the chores around the house. Or they could live with their family and they could live in the ADU. So all of this kind of sounds good in theory, but does it work? Well, I have a couple examples. My daughter-in-law lived in Florida with her family, 3 daughters. The grandmother was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So the mom decided to bring her into their home. And at that time, we're talking 10, 15 years ago, it was called a granny flat. So, and they called her at that time GMA. Gma lived in the granny flat, and every day the mom would bring Grandma G over to the house. She had a special chair she would sit in, and she sat there. She didn't feel like she was a burden. She felt like she had life. She was watching these 3 beautiful grandchildren growing up, arguing, bickering, laughing, crying, sharing, Christmas, all the celebrations. And as she sat in that chair with her little Parkinson's, and this is what I was told by, the one granddaughter, she'd sit in her chair, and as the girls walked by, she would look at them and say, "Did you have a busy day?" And they remember that. Now, on the flip side, I had another patient. The daughter took care of her mom, brought her into her home, and she was with her, I don't know, maybe 2 years. And people started getting concerned that the daughter was so involved with the mom's care, and they kept telling her, "You've got to move her to an assisted living." Well, she looked into it, and I'm not sure if you all, I think Greg may have said that the average cost of assisted livings, the lowest that I found in Anne Arundel County, is maybe $4,500, and it can range as high as $12,000. So as she looked at them, she came across a smaller one. She transferred her mom into the assisted living. And from day one until the day she passed, I can still remember her saying how guilty she felt about taking her mom out of her home. The day that she did pass, I actually happened to be with her, because through those years we did become friends. And she kept talking about feeling guilty, moving her mom out of her home. And here it's been 10 years, and still when I have a conversation with her on the phone, she still will say she feels guilty that she took her out of her home. So when I did my own research on the ADUs, I thought, oh my gosh, if only she was educated, she could have kept her mom in her home, with having a caregiver there. And then one of my favorite stories is one of my older patients lived to be 97, and he was able to stay in his home. And I know not a day would go by that he was so grateful and thankful to his sons for keeping him in his home. So I just want to say, I know my presentation is not as long, but I know in my heart that seniors, they want to age in place. They want to stay in their home. So let our seniors reap the benefits of aging in place with affordable housing through ADUs in our community. And just as Matthew McConaughey would say, seniors plus ADUs equals green lights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A wonderful perspective to help us understand the larger ramifications of this. And our last panelist, we're back to those who are elected to service, is Alderman Dewan Gay from the Annapolis City Council.
Thank you. And I'll be very, very brief in the interest of time. My name's Alderman Gay. I represent the 6th ward in the city of Annapolis, a ward that's primarily made up of public housing and subsidized housing. I'm the chair of the Housing and Human Welfare Committee, and I'm also the co-chair of the Affordable Housing Task Force, along with Eric Smith and Elijah Herrick-Berg. And so we have been meeting since last April for the task force. And we've gone through 4 phases: the needs assessment, the feasibility, the recommendations, policy recommendations, and we're now moving into the community engagement and hoping to make a presentation to the council within the next month to meet our June deadline for legislation due to it being an election year. So we have got a variety of recommendations that we think will move the city forward in regards to housing policy. We'll get the council support. As mentioned, we had tried to do the accessory dwelling unit legislation last year. I was jealous when you said it passed 9-0 because I think ours failed 5-4. I was grateful that Alderman Schandelmeyer was brought on to the council and had been willing to champion it again. And hopefully this time we can get the support behind it. The last time around, to the point that the councilman from Montgomery County made, there have been a lot of complaints and NIMBYism, really, of, I don't want this in my backyard, and the accessory dwelling, the excuse of it's undermining the single family zoning. And so I think that the cases that you guys laid out today, and I really won't dive into much of it, can debunk many of those claims, down to the parking and the amount of traffic and impact that would have on our streets. I think one study in Louisville, Kentucky, actually, where we looked at last year, indicated it, to your point, that more often than not, individuals who lived in accessory dwelling units were relying on public transportation. So they were actually, doubling the revenue for the city by both their place that they lived in and their public transportation participation, which most cities desperately need as it relates to public transportation. But I just wanted to go through some really quick facts. Alderman Shandelmeyer touched on a number of them. But from the City of Annapolis 5-year housing consolidated plan, which is good until 2025, this has been critically important. The Office of Planning and Zoning, in conjunction, which was then the Housing and Community Development Commission, worked through this report. Teresa Wellman, who's the director of that department, and Urban Design Ventures out of Pittsburgh, came together to put this report together. It's full of ton of information, so I would encourage viewers to check it out. But I will just speak to some points really quickly as it relates to housing affordability, because we don't like to call it affordable housing, because affordable housing means different things to everybody. But housing affordability is one thing. You want to make sure that housing is affordable. And speaking to that point, the largest problem in the city of Annapolis is affordability, according to the 2011-2015 ACS data, and that's where a majority of the statistics come from the 5-year housing report. 47% of all renter households are cost burdened by 30% or more, and 26% of owner households with a mortgage are cost burdened by 30% or more. And so ideally, households should be no more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. However, when these households pay more than 50%, that's when they're considered severely cost burdened. And that is what we're seeing in the city of Annapolis. As Alderman Alderman Shandelmeyer mentioned, rents now are roughly about $3,200 to $3,500. When this report was introduced 5 years ago, rents were $1,300. And so we've seen a drastic increase in housing affordability in the city of Annapolis in just 4 to 5 years. At the time of the report, there were 1,700 households that made $20,000 per year. That's less than 22% of households' area median income. 13% of those households were in houses affordable to them. 87%, about 1,400 families, were not in houses that were affordable to them. While on the other hand, we look at, and I'll just go through the data again very quickly, there were 1,600 families within household income between $20,000 and $35,000, with about 39% of that's about 39% of the household area median income. 78% of those households were not in housing considered affordable to them. It was important that someone mentioned earlier what we're calling middle housing or median housing. Part of the problem, and I mentioned earlier, is that I represent a area that has a significant amount of subsidized and public housing. At the time of this report, and it's grown since, that public housing waiting list for public housing and vouchers had about 2,500 households on them. 51% were considered extremely low income, while 55% were families with children, and 85% of those were African-American families. And something that the data show from this report is that trend continued, and that African-American families are more likely to be in poverty in the city of Annapolis, and they make up about 22% of the city's impoverished levels. Continuing on the point that I made previously, because oftentimes people say, oh, well, we have a lot of public housing in the city of Annapolis and a lot of subsidized housing. So why are people having issues finding affordable housing? Because it's maxed to capacity. As I just mentioned, the wait list, but I just wanted to go into quickly some statistics. 42% of the housing in the city of Annapolis is subsidized multifamily rental housing, which makes up about 5,046 multifamily rental units. 18% of those are public housing, 26% are tax credit vouchers, and that is expected to increase in the next report due to the county's legislation in 2019 that allowed for individual landowners to accept vouchers. I think it was the housing discrimination policy. There was the option to what they were calling discriminate against the voucher. Now you can't do that. So we're expecting that to increase. And while only 4%, 0.4% were moderately priced dwelling units, which we were hoping would increase significantly, but that has not. And then lastly, one significant point that we made at the last attempt at the accessory dwelling units legislation is that this report showed there are 15,779 occupied units in the city of Annapolis at the time of this report. 8,210 were owner occupied, while 7,557 were renter occupied, which left roughly 1,764 vacant housing units. Of that, the median rent of those housing units was about $2,800. The majority of the owner occupied housing are 3 or more bedrooms, which is about 75% of our housing stock. And so one of the reasons why the accessory dwelling unit would just be so significant is because we are finding that, as mentioned previously, there are elders and young students and young families attempting to move into the city, and they just can't find housing. We've reached capacity on our housing. One of the reports that Alderman Schandelmeyer showed earlier showed that when ranking the city of Annapolis using our median homes sales against median family income, we rank as some of the worst with Seattle, Miami, New York, San Diego in housing affordability. This small city of 7 square miles is ranked as some of the worst with those large cities. So look, as Alderman Schandelmeyer has said, it will be a challenge. I think that some of our colleagues are concerned with the single family zoning concern, as mentioned previously. So I look forward to hearing some of the comments as it relates to that. But I'm hopeful that this time around we can get this passed. Just looking at the statistics, there is no reason why we wouldn't accept this alternative form of housing, really to help families here. So I'm definitely hopeful that we can get this on the right track.
Thank you, Alderman Gay. Thank you to all of the panelists. We have quite a few questions, and chances are we will not get to all of them before our time is up. We will finish tonight at 7:30. But we do know that Alderman Schandelmeyer has another commitment and needs to leave fairly soon. So we want to get the questions that are addressed specifically to him out of the way first of all. And by the way, Alderman Schandelmeyer and Alderman Gay, I want to begin with a question that came to us via email. So it is not in the document that some of you are seeing, but one of the persons who wrote to us in advance of tonight's forum asked what there would be in the legislation that would stop people like the person who wrote, admitted that someone like me, from building one of these units and charging an awful lot of money to visitors. In other words, like an Airbnb kind of situation. What would prohibit that from happening?
If I could take the start on that point, we have something explicit in the ordinance that prevents this from being used for short-term housing or short-term rentals. I wanted that included because the goal of this was to provide a sustainable long-term housing option to people. And a lot of people wanting to put this forward would try to treat it as a STR otherwise. As for another issue of why could they charge a lot of money, etc., I know a lot of people go, well, why are you defending something that's going to cost $15,000 to $2,000 a month to rent out? That's not affordable. Well, no, not exactly. But here's why I'm defending that. Because if we don't defend that now, in 4 years, we're going to have to defend $2,500 a month as a potentially affordable option. And 4 years from there, it's going to be 3,000. This is our goal line. I want to improve that, but this is our goal line. And if we don't hold the line there, as you guys saw in that graph, that is going to skyrocket.
I would just add to that that one of the policy and recommendations that the task force plans to introduce to the council are rent caps. And I think that the pandemic has shown us, why that is necessary. When we see individuals just literally struggling to make ends meet, and one paycheck ruin lives. That's one of the things that I deal with daily is the eviction crisis as we, get closer and closer to the eviction moratorium. And so, to the alderman's point, this is, nothing compared to what it could be.
And market rates on these buildings do tend to be comparable to the apartments in the area. And in Annapolis, an apartment about this size, 850 square feet, does tend to be $1,500 to $2,000 range. So this is, again, just another option. We put this in. The surrounding apartments suddenly need to be a little more competitive because you have this new built single family unit nearby that someone could live in and get a little more space. Well, I'm going to have to either A, improve what I have in this apartment complex, or B, lower my cost. This is some pretty simple supply and demand level stuff that we are getting into while expanding this option.
A couple of questions specifically for you. Can you explain the study process that the bill is in and how community members provide input? And can you expound on the housing safety standards that are required of ADUs?
Absolutely. So it's going to first go before a planning commission. And one thing that I would really like for anyone watching and who agrees with our efforts to try and expand this housing opportunity is to send testimony to our planning commission. You can find how to do that through our website and let them know that the community thinks this is a good idea. Because these things are traditionally dominated by people who don't want to see change. And so you need to really guide commissioners, and you need to guide elected officials like myself, Alderman Gay, Councilwoman Rodvian, Councilman Reimer. Let us know that we have support if we go out on a limb to try and help something. And let the people who are otherwise opposed to this, they're going out on a limb by getting in the way of this basic social justice element of providing affordable housing. So please reach out to the Annapolis Planning Commission. You can find how to do that on the Annapolis City website. Submit testimony saying this is a good idea. Reach out to myself, Alderman Gay, and our colleagues on the city and council and go, I live in your ward. I support this. Because otherwise, if you don't light a fire under people, they're not going to let things change.
And the housing safety standards?
Oh, yes. Thank you for getting on that. Speaking of fires, that's a good segue too. One of the things I really wanted to cover, especially for interior accessory dwelling units like attics or basement apartments, is basic fire code safety for sheetrock. So that way, if there's a fire in one structure, there's a delay in the building down to the next structure. Same thing with basic sanitary standards for bathrooms, basic safety standards for kitchens. So these are going to have to go through the same basic study process and rental application process that we have to do for other housing sources in the city. And that's going to mean we're going to make sure there's basic smoke detectors are going to be safe, that the carbon monoxide detectors are going to be implemented. So by putting forward that those standards, we're going to make sure that, again, this is a legitimate form of housing. These aren't going to be a slum. These aren't going to be someone throwing a bed in a shed and then charging whatever for it. We're going to make sure that they have heat, insulation, carbon monoxide detection, smoke detection, fire-resistant sheetrock, and all these great safety standards that we can enjoy in other forms of housing, because this is just that, another form of housing.
One person writes, why a maximum size of 850 feet? I have a basement space that is a bit larger than 850.
Because one of the complaints brought forward, and something I may have been a little guilty of, is trying to address arguments made in bad faith from our previous legislation. Someone said, oh, this is too big. Maybe I'll support it if it's this size. Okay. Prove it.
And to that point, yeah, as he mentioned, in the last legislation, the max size was 1,000 square feet, and they were not going for it at all. And so I think this was a compromise, well intended by the councilman. But it would, there would be concerns then. Do you grandfather in existing accessory dwelling units that have historically been larger than 1,000 square feet? And so I think just all conversations that will be had in the planning commission, which as he stated, is critical point for this legislation.
And I want to touch back on that again. Last time it went around, one of the complaints that came forward to the planning commission is the legislation was a lot more complicated than it is now. We've simplified it now to a point where it's just going to go, every district zone for residential, you can build it if it meets that basic size requirement standard set forward by the City of Annapolis Code, 150 square feet, or that maximum requirement, or that maximum amount of 800 square feet. So that's simple. That's something everyone can understand. So now we need to make sure that our planning commission members know that the community supports this idea.
Thank you. Those are the questions that were specifically for you. We appreciate the generosity of your time. And so we understand that you will have to leave at some point, but those are the ones that were specific to you. We have one that was specifically asked of Councilwoman Raviet. How will the bill encourage the ADUs to be used for primary housing rather than short-term rentals that might bring in more money? So we've heard that addressed with regard to the City of Annapolis. How will that be handled in the county?
So there's a couple ways we can do this. And of course, this is going to be part of the larger discussion when we get into the nitty-gritty and details of the bill that the council brings forward. But one way you can discourage that is just say you can't do it. There's a lot of places that have that strict requirement and say you can't use an auxiliary. I've called them auxiliary dwelling units for a long time. Accessory dwelling unit for the purposes of a short-term rental. So that's one possibility. There could be other sorts of impact fee tax benefits that maybe you provide if the owner commits to using it for long-term housing. Maybe you could add to that long-term affordable housing as well. So I think there's definitely options of ways to do that. And I do think that it's important to keep at least some of that pressure in place, or honestly, I would prefer an outright restriction. Because if the point is to create housing, we need to create housing and not just lodging. Lodging is obviously needed in a town, in a county like Anne Arundel County, where tourism is a big part of our economy. But we also have to make sure that we have housing.
Thank you. Someone asked, how do ground level ADUs avoid increasing impermeable land and avoid impermeable land restrictions? Anybody want to take that one on?
I could speak to a few other questions or comments that have been made as well. Well, first of all, it's important to remember, most likely, the ADU and the house combined would not be larger than what a house could be if the house wanted to expand too. Generally, you have a certain size that you can build a house. And what we did in Montgomery County was we said, you can't build the house and ADU combination any larger than you could otherwise build a house. So that was very fair. Now, there were certainly some people who didn't accept that, that was, I think their real objective was just to stop ADUs less than to protect the environment. But most impacts you see in this manner of people's land being covered up with impervious surface is going to come from people adding on to their house. And why should someone be able to add on to a house and make it really, really expensive, but another person can't add on to the house essentially to make it more affordable? I think that's kind of a basic justice issue there that it needs to be recognized. I want to just add a couple things on the issue of the size of the unit. I think every community can make a choice about 850 square feet, 1,200 square feet. Carl Peterson says 850 tends to be more for like 1 to 2 people. 1,200 tends to be more for like a family. Like if it's smaller than 850, you're not likely to have a family moved in, but at 1,200 you might. We opted for the 1,200. I think 850 is a very reasonable number to use as well. But if you have a basement that is larger than 850, as someone commented, I think it makes sense to say you can use your whole basement. So that was one of those details that we landed upon when people wrote in and said, my basement is 1,400 square feet. Are you really saying I should build a wall on one side of the basement and block it off? And that would have been required if we hadn't said it's 1,200 feet or the footprint of your basement. So these kinds of details really become, important. Questions about parking. One of the reasons why we never got an increase of ADUs in the past was we required a parking spot or more, 2 parking spots for an ADU. And when you have to build a parking spot, then you're covering over more of the yard. You may not even have the room for a parking new driveway. It's really expensive. You might not proceed with it at all, which is why we weren't. So we said, well, let's look at the need for this in the first place. And we found there weren't more cars anyway. So why should we require people to build a bigger driveway if there aren't even any more cars really in the first place? That doesn't, there's plenty of street parking given every 3 ADUs is going to have 1 more car. So last thing I'll say, taxes. Our county executive, who really fought us on this, kind of resisted it all the way through. He did kind of suggest we ought to charge a school impact tax or a transportation impact tax. These projects are expensive. It might cost you $75,000, $100,000 to do a basement apartment. It might cost you $250,000 to do a backyard cottage, unless you get a really nice modular unit like what Greg Cantori's proposed. But if you add on $10,000, $20,000 of expenses, someone might not be able to move forward. And why do you need to do that? If they don't produce more children than the regular houses do, then really what's the justification anyway? So thank you.
I have a couple more questions for you. One of which I'm particularly interested in. Someone asked how you overcame the naysayers and critics. Did you do community meetings or other methods?
Certainly did a lot of community meetings. I don't know if the alderman wanted to comment. He had his hand up a moment ago.
I'm not seeing that.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the thing, but I do want to comment. Our bill does require 1 off-street parking space, and I put that in writing it before I genuinely knew and had a lot of the data provided by experts and other jurisdictions, such as Mr. Reimer or Councilman Reimer.
Yeah, totally.
It's a weak point of the bill. It's a weak point of this bill, and I'm gonna get rid of it and still pass it.
Take a look at. I suggest taking a look at that. And one of the things about this bill, you'll find it's so full of details that are so important. I mean, I didn't really go through all the details of our bill because I didn't want to introduce anything into your conversation that isn't already there, frankly. But it got really, really complex and hard to understand as a legislator. So, anyway, that's just one of the.
And you're going to be a wonderful resource for all of these wonderful folk who serve us here. So about the overcoming the naysayers and critics.
Well, I mean, we presented the facts to the people who we needed to persuade, which were the council members. And I think, the public was very receptive because the public, people are living in a different way these days. It was fertile ground already where more and more people, as our panelists have said, like they want to allow an older relative to move in but live with some independence, or they have an adult child with disabilities, developmental disabilities. They want to be able to live with some independence. Those facts on the ground are different today than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Plus the cost of housing generally is so difficult, so inaccessible. And I know it's a crisis in Anne Arundel. So the public is far more supportive today than it once was. And when we were able to combine that general support with some really helpful facts and figures, council members really agreed.
Thank you. Someone asked, does Annapolis have an inventory of current ADUs, even the unpermitted ones? I can't wait to hear the answer to that. As I drive around the city, I see a lot of what I assume are unpermitted ADUs.
Well, as someone who once resided in one of those, no, we do not.
And there were 11 or 15 that were actually permitted last year. Only 11 or 15 in the city. So yeah.
Okay.
I would also say, can I comment on this one? I think a lot of times people confuse people who are living in a house together with people who are living in an accessory dwelling unit. Those are different. You can have multiple people in a house. You have a certain limit on that in your code. And a lot of people will see that and they'll say, look, there's 3 cars in the driveway. I know that there are 10 people in that house. It must be an accessory dwelling unit. It may not be. It may just be that there's people living in that house. Maybe they have adult children that live there. So there likely are far fewer ADUs than people might think. ADUs are expensive to build. You gotta have a kitchen. You gotta have a bathroom. It's very costly. And just living over a garage is not the same thing as living in an ADU.
Point well taken. Is it a common issue people can run into with single-family homes with ADUs being evaluated as multifamily dwellings and impacting qualifying for loan applications? It is my understanding that an ADU should transform a single-family dwelling to become a multifamily dwelling. If we encourage people to build ADUs, what do they need to be aware of to avoid the multifamily dwelling issue when selling or refinancing?
Let me start with that one if I could, please, because this is one of the most interesting parts of this discussion. The question of whether your house, if you have an ADU, is now more valuable than it was without an ADU, that depends entirely on whether people would actually want to buy a house with an ADU in it. And I think the reality there is very murky. Most people in the housing market are not looking for a house with an apartment in it. They're looking for a house for themselves and their family. So actually, if you are a homeowner, I think you have to be very cautious about believing that doing this would result in a higher property value or a higher resale. Do it because you want to do it. Maybe the rental income is meaningful, but how many buyers in the market want to buy a house with an ADU? If you think about that a little bit, I think you'll realize not that many. And that's why the banks don't really value them very much. They might value them a little, but there aren't a lot of practices now around valuing ADUs anyway. So the banks, it's still nascent and not very clear. So, when I moved into my house where I live today, there were features of previous ADUs that had been built into the house. What was the first thing I did? I removed them because we didn't want them in our house because we were a family and we needed the space for the family. So, that's closer to the reality. The homeowner who's there wants it, the tenant who's there wants it, future buyers, very unclear.
Could I just add to that point? In regards to the affordability of it, as he mentioned, $75,000 to $100,000 for the construction of an accessory dwelling unit. And one of the things that we discussed in the last bill to incentivize it, the actual building of these accessory dwelling units, was creating special tax exemptions for the property tax for individuals who rent out the accessory dwelling unit to a low income individual or family. Obviously, that'd have to track through planning and zoning, and an application would have to be filed and completed by both the homeowner and the rentee. But the point is that you just have to incentivize. Otherwise, people won't. As he mentioned, right now, the market isn't, designed for, people to be attracted to homes with accessory dwelling units, but we don't know what that will look like in 5 years. And so I think that to incentivize people to do so now, we to incentivize people to do so now, we just have to get creative with what we, entice them with. People want property tax cuts if they're going to build $100,000 investment on their property and rent it to a low income family. And so I think at some point we have to play that game of providing for both the low income and the actual individual investing in the property.
Thank you. We do have a question about below market rates, but I want to come back to that and address a couple of other items that are more in the weeds of the legislation. Will completely separate metered utilities be required? This is very expensive for the property owner. So is a separate sewer tap. And will the bill have amnesty for currently unpermitted ADUs? We just heard that what we may think are currently unpermitted ADUs may not actually be ADUs. But to the extent that there are current unpermitted ADUs, will the bill have amnesty for those?
No, not at the time. As for the water meters and sewer stuff, the bill requires a separate water meter for water going in, but we do not actually require a separate sewer line. It can connect to the primary home. And Councilman Reimer actually brought up something where we don't really need amnesty for anybody, because the city doesn't provide this and currently really allow them. So I'm sure that these buildings and things that we think are ADUs are something else, with the exception of the one that I was in. And I'm fine with it that way, because the goal of this is to try and actually provide some housing stock. And if they're already there, cool.
The owner can just apply for a license. I mean, amnesty implies that they would be punished. They won't be punished. They'll be granted a license when they meet the code. They can just do that.
Someone wants to know what measures can be taken to ensure that the ADUs would rent at below market rates to add to the affordable housing stock.
Could I try that?
So,
go ahead.
If you don't mind, because then after this, I got to hop to another town hall. For me, the big thing is when you put in these market caps that push forward it actually prevents them from being built. So by putting these in, they are, by the market forces, going to end up at general market cost. And that expansion of general market cost housing at this level is going to force other housing units to either improve themselves to justify this higher cost, or lower their price to keep up with what this provides. A unit around the same space, around the same price, but with additional privacy, which is a better market value.
And I'll just add there, the housing is more affordable than what is otherwise available in the neighborhood. I think that's the point, is if you want to get a single family house in a neighborhood, it's going to cost you a lot of money, and ADU is going to cost you less money. So it's more affordable. I think the Alderman was making that point earlier. It's not necessarily, housing for the lowest income residents. That's typically going to be subsidized housing, with support from your housing commission and state and county sources. But it's more affordable than what is otherwise available at that location, because it's a small apartment rather than a big house. But there are ways you could, your housing commission could provide rental subsidies to a person, and then that person could rent an ADU if that is certainly an option. But generally speaking, when I have encountered this, it has been more of an attempt to oppose accessory dwelling units. People say, well, we shouldn't really, it's not really for affordable housing. We shouldn't support, well, it's more affordable than the neighborhood otherwise would be. And that's an important price point that we need to be able to provide.
We're looking for the missing middle housing with this.
Right.
For people that I used to bartend with, for the young professional coming into town that has a good paying job, but can't afford a $35,000 a month house or $3,500 a month.
Housing is actually just a room in a house. That is really affordable. And if you really want to reach the lower income population, often it's going to be more that kind of setting than a full apartment.
And the bottom line is more housing in general of any type, whether it's affordable or unaffordable, increases the supply, which therefore should start to decrease the costs overall. So in general, I wanted to bring up one point about the utilities too, is that one of the concerns that I've heard and seen around is this issue, is this become something like a multi-unit tenements or multi-unit apartments or something, and it's not, because in almost every single case, ADUs share the exact same address as the main house. So one of the things that makes it different is an apartment has its own separate address, and these have shared utilities and a shared address.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time together, and there are several unanswered questions, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately. I think that we'll end with this one. Well, actually two. Is the bill on the draft agenda for the Planning Commission on May 20th? So that should be fairly easy to answer. Is the bill on the draft agenda for the Planning Commission on May 20th?
It is, I don't know if the exact date is May 20th, but it is on the agenda for the next Planning Commission meeting. I think it's actually at the beginning of May, not May 20th.
Okay. And how can the public help advocate for ADUs in Annapolis? I have been a pastor for 25 years. I am one of those geriatric patients that Ms. Shremick mentioned, and I will be retiring at some point, looking for some place I can afford on my pension. So this is close to my heart. I know that people want to remain in their homes. I spend a lot of time going to various long-term care facilities. And I know that no one wants to be there. They want to remain in their homes or nearby relatives who will care for them. You know, there are more and more baby boomers aging every day. So how can the public help advocate for ADUs in Annapolis? What can we do to help?
For clarification, the Planning Commission meeting is May the 20th at 7:00 p.m. So what you can do is, because of COVID right now, you'll have two opportunities because they've required that the Planning Commission be extended for an additional public hearing, because people are obviously everything's virtual. And so if you go to the city's webpage, you'll find links there for both, one, so that you can view, and two, so that you can submit public comment to the Planning Commission meeting. That can be done both virtually, and it can be done via written testimony. You'll also have an opportunity, as the bill is introduced on first reader at our next council meeting, to make public comment there. And so that is, I'm sorry, I should know this. That is Monday the 26th, yeah, at 7:00. And so that that could be live testimony or written testimony as well on this particular legislation. And as the Alderman mentioned earlier, you know, the driving factor in all of this is the individual council people. The bill failed last year 5-4. It was one vote short. And so just honing in on some of the things that we touched in, I think the three most important things are, you know, one, this does not undermine single family zoning. So if that could be expressed to the individual council members, it also, there are safety standards and fire standards to be met. One of the huge complaints that we had last time from a very mobile civic association was that it would send us back in time. You know, there would be no sewage required and all that. That's the furthest thing from the truth, and it is required. So if that could be expressed to the individual council men and members as well. And then lastly, is just the last piece of what we're calling housing affordability. As both Greg, Councilman Reimer have mentioned, yes, it won't be, a $500 a month, dwelling unit, and it won't fix all of our housing affordability issues overnight. But what it will do is add to the market and create opportunities for people to live within this city. As I mentioned earlier, a majority, over 50%, nearly 65% of our housing in the city is subsidized or public housing. And so if you don't meet the criteria for that as it relates to income, you are screwed. And you really are looking for, unregulated dwelling units or living multiple to a family. As the report also mentioned, we have some of the highest number of multiple families to a house in Ward 6 as well. And so we got to get serious about addressing these issues. And so if you could just express that to the individual council people, I think it will be great. We just need one vote. I believe there are 4 co-sponsors right now. And so please. In particular, I'll just be right up. In particular, wards 8, 1, and 3. If we could work with those council members, that could, be significantly helpful.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for this evening. There were a number of other questions, as I have said, and so there has been a lively interest in this topic. And I hope that those of you who are watching and who are interested in this have heard that these elected officials are very interested in a continued dialogue with you. So there are a number of ways that you can make that happen. I want to thank Action Annapolis for the invitation to moderate this evening. I always enjoy supporting you in the wonderful and meaningful work that you do in our community. On behalf of Action Annapolis and our fair city and county, many thanks to Greg Cantori, Brooke Schandelmeyer, Lisa Rodbian, Hans Raymer, Lois Schremek, and Dewan Gay. God's blessings to all of you as you continue to do what you do. And I hope that we will all live in peace and safety for many, many days to come. Councilman Reimer put a document in the chat that you may find interesting. He also shared his contact information with us. So again, thank you all for the generosity of your time and for educating us on this.
Is it possible to have the transcript sent to us of this chat? I think it could be saved and sent afterwards.
Action Annapolis?
Yes.
Duan, you can actually get a copy of yourself by hitting those little dots at the bottom of the chat, and it'll say copy chat.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.
You'll copy it to your Finder. Did you see it?
I was really happy to be part of this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Allen.
Stay safe.
Mm.